Hello and welcome to the Hafod Family Bible Study today. This week we're looking at the influences on Christian theology. Last week we looked at the exile and how much that impacted how Israel saw itself in relation to God. This week we're going to be talking about the Reformations. The Reformations are a period of social, political and religious upheaval that ran roughly from the beginning of the 1500s through to some time in the 1600s, maybe as far as the middle of the 1600s, depending on when you see the Reformations as moving on into the Reconstruction. You will have heard me say the word Reformations, using the plural rather than the more common Reformation, the singular, because the period was not one single connected Reformation, but rather a series of individual events that all kind of conspired all at the same time to cause this great big change in our understanding of the church and our understanding of being. So a Reformation is a period of reforming. Now, reforming is putting something back together that was maybe being broken. So putting it back together in a new way to reform it. This video is going to be an attempt at a whistle-stop tour of the Reformations, focusing mainly on the theological changes, but it's almost impossible to get away completely from the political changes that were going on at the time. We do need to remember that the Reformations covered all of Europe, all of it, and it's very difficult to separate the Reformation itself from the politics that was going on at the time. It's set against the backdrop of a politically powerful Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church at the time, under the leader of the Pope, was not just a church, but also essentially a political and military institution. At the time, the Pope, and through their embassies and cardinals, were known to interfere in the way in which countries ruled themselves and the decisions which they made. As you can see, this would make a lot of rulers quite unhappy with the way in which the Pope was dealing with their country. This was not a new thing. Back in the 1400s in the UK, rules had been passed to limit the power of the Pope. Now, those rules are going to be important when we come to look at Henry VIII. But for now, just bear in mind that this is not just a new thing that kind of appears out of nowhere in the 1500s. Now we begin in a rather unusual and quiet place with the Erasmus, the Dutch scholar. In 1516, he published his translation of the New Testament in Greek, and he published it in Latin. This is a seeming non-event in the world, and probably would have just been one of those many books that languished only on interested scholars' shelves, had not his translation become to inspire quite a few other translations, which with the thanks to the later invention of the printing press, began quite a big change of the world. First on the scene is Martin Luther. Martin Luther, at this point in time, is a friar teaching at Wittenberg University. At the time, Wittenberg University was not really a great research institution. It was just one of the many that had popped up throughout Germany. We do also need to remember that Germany at this point is not a unified state like we have it today, but rather a series of individual kingdoms, all working together to as sort of the current German state. Martin Luther hears the street preachers. Now, these are street preachers that have come from Rome to preach about a thing called indulgences. The indulgences were being used to raise money for St. Paul's Cathedral because the Pope wanted it to be repaired and get it to be bigger and a bit more impressive. An indulgence was a way in which you could pay real money to be able to release your soul from purgatory or from hell, and sort of wipe away your sins. Not only could you do it for yourself, but you could do it for your loved one. Indulgences were designed as a way of shortcutting the more popular way of atoning for your sins by doing maybe a pilgrimage or doing good works, or doing things that actually made a difference both to you as a person and to the people around you. This was essentially a pay-to-win way of getting out of hell. The indulgences were means tested, and you were paying roughly 1% of your annual income to step away from the sins that you had committed. Martin Luther was incensed by this, so he was incredibly angry, and he did what a lot of scholars do in that situation when the world annoys him. He retired to his study and wrote a very long article about just how wrong these people were. He then took this article and effectively posted it to the Facebook, the Tumblr, the Twitter of its day, which was the church door. Now, Martin Luther wasn't really known as a person, so he didn't instantly go viral. But people read this treatise, and coupled with kind of the general unrest that was going on, people really caught fire with this idea that you didn't have to go to the Pope in order to get yourself forgiven, that you could go directly to God yourself. Unsurprisingly, the Pope is unimpressed by this. Luther argued that if the Pope could release people from purgatory or from hell, then why didn't the Pope just do it out of charity and out of love for people, as we're told to do as Christians, and not start charging them money for it? You can imagine that this went down in Catholic circles pretty much like a lead balloon. Suddenly, Luther found himself at the centre of quite a large controversy. For Luther, you were justified, that is, made right, in the face of God by your faith in God alone. The Pope summoned him to Rome, and probably if he'd gone to Rome, this would have been the last we would have heard of him. But he was protected by the ruler, Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Why the ruler did it is a bit unclear, but the Pope's power was beginning to wane, and the Elector found himself at this point being able to stand up to the Pope, which not only gave him political power as being one who was able to stand up to this powerful entity, but also gave him political power amongst other people who looked to him then as a powerful ruler. So Elector Frederick protects Luther, and this gives Luther time to focus on things that are dear to his heart, like exploring his understanding of the Bible. The Pope, unable to arrest him, sends people to debate with him, which then managed to enable Luther's idea to reach a wider audience, because clearly the Pope thought this was a bad idea, and people like to watch debates and arguments, bearing in mind this is before TV. So Luther's idea suddenly begins spreading. In 1520, Luther is excommunicated. Now, it sounds like a word that we just bandy around, but he had essentially just been thrown out of society. Society at the time was focused and located around churches. They were administrative centres, the places in which you were the only place, in some places, you could get married. And without being able to go to the church, a lot of civic things were now barred to him. So this is quite a big deal. So Luther is excommunicated and his writings are publicly burnt. In response, Luther takes the papal bull, that's the papal announcement that says he's excommunicated, and burns it. You can see that this argument is not one that's going away anytime soon. In 1521, a gathering is called a diet. It's a German word for gathering at a place called Worms. This is diet of Worms, not as sometimes mispronounced in Hamlet, a diet of Worms. And it is probable that in Hamlet it is this event that the diet of Worms is referring to. At this gathering, they debated with Luther and asked for Luther to recant. That is to say that he doesn't really believe all the things that he's said. Luther, by way of defence, said, "Unless I am convinced by scripture and pure reason, I cannot accept the authority of popes and councils because they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against my conscience is neither safe nor right. God help me." He may or may not have also said the slightly more famous and pithy line, "Here I stand, I can do no other," but we don't know whether or not he actually did say that. The Diet waited until everyone that supported Luther had gone, and then, in their absence, condemned him. Frederick the Wise then took Luther and hid him in a castle, where Luther went on to publish a whole host of books. He reordered the New Testament by pulling out the books that now go into the Apocrypha. If you remember, we talked about that when we looked at our series on Scripture, and creating a section of the Bible, which we don't use today, into which he put James, Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation. He translated these Greek books into German, which has had the same effect on the German language as the KJV has had on the English language. Luther also reduced the sacraments. Now, the sacraments is a special way of saying, a special way of giving the grace of God to the people. And he reduced the number of sacraments from 7 down to 2. He excluded confirmation, marriage, ordination, extreme unction, and penance up to a point. And he kept baptism and the Eucharist. In Luther's absence, his friends and supporters began reforming the churches. And they did this by removing icons. They would celebrate the Eucharist in plain clothes, that is, without robes, and began kind of doing a lot of other changes to the church to make it plain and simple. And Luther, by and large, approved until this got violent. And this was a pattern that we're going to be seeing repeated in a lot of times. It begins with a good-hearted, in most cases, reformer whose followers kind of let things get out of hand and things kind of spiral. Now, Luther does not get a free pass on this, as we will see later. We're now going to move to the Swiss state, Zurich, in 1522. In 1522, a tired and hungry printer ate sausage and egg. Not a big deal. The guy had breakfast. But it was Ash Wednesday. And on Ash Wednesday, you're meant to be fasting, that is, stepping away from food. And so he had broken Lent. This wasn't just a Christian faux pas, but also a legal faux pas. The printer explained that the great preacher, Ulrich Zwingli, said that there was no law over the Christian except the Bible. Zwingli goes out to bat for this printer, and in 1523 a public debate is held between Zwingli and the bishop. The Council of Zurich finds in Zwingli's favour, and in doing so managed to take power back from the bishop into the hands of the council. Again, we've got a point here where religion and power are beginning to get intertwined. The council is seeking not just to approve Zwingli's ideas, but also to get their power back, rather than just kind of be a puppet council of the Roman Catholic Church. Zwingli then goes on to convince the churches to remove all icons and adornments, to break up the minister's organ. Instead of a minister robed, as we have in Anglican churches, with their back to the congregations, which we don't do anymore, services were now simple and plain. There were no hymns, they were short. They were celebrated by a table in the middle of people where everybody gathered around them, and bread and wine is handed out to them. Now that's an important change, because up to this point, basically before Luther, it was only the priest that received the wine. Zwingli, unlike Luther, saw the Bible as a precise and dictating manual for church life. For Luther, if it wasn't explicitly forbidden by the Bible, it was permitted. For Zwingli, it was the other way round. If it didn't explicitly say it in the Bible, then it was forbidden. For Zwingli, he would go further than just saying it was forbidden, but he would use this term Antichrist. Now, we're going to probably see that term quite a bit, so we're just going to segue and talk about it. The Antichrist is a term that turns up in the Bible in the letters of John. In the letters of John, it is not the Antichrist, but a Antichrist. So there are many Antichrists, and it simply means in the letters of John, somebody who is acting against Christ. Here in Zwingli, we get to see the beginning of this modern idea of the Antichrist as kind of being kind of this demon that we see in a lot of horror films. Zwingli and Luther also parted on the Eucharist. Zwingli sees it as nothing but a remembrance, in that nothing magical is happening, that it is just that a sacrament at its root means oath. So a sacrament is just a remembrance of the oath that Christians take. For Luther, the sacrament had something mysterious about it and valuable, so that it wasn't just a reenacted remembrance reminding you of an oath, but there was some kind of act of God happening in the Eucharist. Before long, Zwingli, like Luther, was horrified to see that their followers were taking things so too far. A man called Konrad Grebel, a Zurich, I hope I'm saying that right, a Zurich scholar, argued that if baptism, sacraments, were not a mystical challenge of grace, then people should only be baptized as adults. This was not just a radical theological change, but a radical social change. If you remember, I've already said that the church was kind of the heart of society. And everybody was made a member of the church by baptism at birth. So they were all welcome to take part in all the civics and all the stuff that was going on. Grebel wanted to make this optional. And this was one of those points that it was just too far, even for Zwingli, even though it is a logical ending of a lot of Zwingli's understandings of the Bible understanding. Grebel argues that in the Bible, it is not explicitly said that children should be baptized, and therefore you shouldn't do it. In a pattern that we've already seen before, these rebaptizers, these people who are rebaptizing people as adults, so denying that the baptism that they had had as a child had any effect, so they became known as the rebaptizers, the Anabaptists. And fascinatingly, the Anabaptists are still not actually held in high regard in a lot of denominations. In the original conception of the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church, the Anabaptists are mentioned by name as being something that you recant when you accept the 39 Articles. So they were given 8 days because they hadn't been baptizing their children. They were given 8 days to catch up in January of 1525. They refused and violence ensued. The first martyr of the Anabaptists, the first of many martyrs of these rebaptizers in 1527, was somebody called Felix Manz, who was martyred through the rather ironic form of drowning. Over in Germany, the misappropriation of Luther's ideas by the poor led to a revolt against their lords between 1524 and 1525. The poor began looting churches and episcopal mansions. Initially, Luther was on the side of the poor, suggesting that maybe the lords were causing this unhappiness because they were being oppressive. As the violence continued, Luther turned against them, suggesting that these people who were refusing to act in a Christian way should be put down. And he does use quite strong language, saying that they should be put down either in public, in secret, or by fire, or any means necessary. It didn't take much for the lords to take this as an excuse. 10,000 peasants were killed in this revolt. And this revolt shows us that even though people were saying that they were doing it in the name of Luther, they were amongst lots of other people who were revolting for the very expedient problem of the fact that the lords were basically oppressing them. It is this idea and these ideas that kind of begin to form a lot of unrest throughout Europe, and we begin to see these ideas re-emerge in the French Revolution in the 1700s. We're now going to go back to, if you remember, Erasmus had printed his Bible. Luther had taken that Bible and printed it in German. In 1526, somebody called William Tyndale escapes England to a Luther-controlled Germany because he wants to print his Bible in English. You might be asking yourself, why was this a big deal? For a long time, the Bible had been printed only in Latin, considered to be the language of the angels. And the Catholic scholars feared that they would have to end up debating with the peasants and shoemakers, because anybody could read the Bible, but they'd be doing so without an education, which would mean that they would come up with what the Catholic scholars thought of as wrong ideas. But in 1526, William Tyndale said that was actually what he wanted. He wanted everybody to be able to read and to understand the gospel. So against the diktats of the Pope and fearing for his own life, which he does eventually get martyred for doing this, he produces this pocket-sized Bible, and it's quickly smuggled back to England. Later in 1526, the Bishop of London claimed to have found some 2,000 errors in translation. Now this is an interesting way of putting it, because both the bishop and Tyndale were incredibly good Greek scholars. So it is likely that what the bishop meant is that he found 2,000 differences between the Latin Vulgate translation and the translation that Tyndale had done. In 1527, things are beginning to heat up. We have wars beginning to break out in Europe, and Charles V in 1527 takes the Pope prisoner until such time as the Pope becomes more amenable to Charles. This becomes a problem in England and begins to draw England into the whole matter of the Reformation. And this is important because the English Bible goes on much later than this, but it is this part that allows the Bible to reach the stage in which it comes in the King James translation, but we will come to that in another video. As we all know, King Henry VIII was seeking a divorce. Normally, the Pope would have no problem with this. It would take some money, a bit of greasing and a bit of grovelling, but Charles V wasn't willing to let the Pope do that because at the time, Henry is married to a relative of Charles V. We then end up in this political religious crossover. It should be remembered that Henry VIII himself is quite a big theological scholar. He had been gifted the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope himself for refuting Luther's writing, the Babylon Exile of the Church. So Henry VIII is actually well clued up on what is going on in the Reformation and has himself waded theologically into this argument. For those that are also wondering, Henry VIII also wrote a whole bunch of poetry. He was an intelligent man. He wrote plays and poetry, and his reputation, which we tend to see as just this kind of womanizer while entirely true, tends to do him a bit of a disservice. But yes, he is trying to get himself a divorce. Charles V isn't up for this, so Henry begins trying to find another way of doing this. He sees in the Bible, and with the help of Boker, finds ways in which he is able to break from the church. Now, if you remember, I mentioned at the start that one of Henry's predecessors had already began writing laws that limited the Pope's power. Combined with those, the Reformations, and his understanding of the Bible, Henry VIII was able to break from the power of the Pope, diminished because he is under the arrest of Charles V, ironically, in order to be able to get his divorce. It should be said at this point that none of those leaders ever intended to break completely from their theological and faith-based understanding of the Catholic Church. That was just where it ended up. The Catholic Church at the time refused to yield or to bend, even though these reformers were trying to reform the Catholic Church. So not create a new one, but reform it. The Catholic Church refused to be reformed, and so these reformers found themselves outside of the Catholic Church, essentially forming their own churches. In the case of Henry VIII, he began a period in the UK that led to quite a lot of bloody changes, especially after he died. We have a whole series of political changes that involve a return to Catholicism and the murdering under the Catholic Queen Mary of lots of reformers, lots of people who were trying to build this new church under Henry. Mary's dream of returning the UK to Catholicism backfires because as she began to round up the reformers fled over to Europe, where they become more influenced by the ideas of Luther, of Zwingli, and of Calvin. So when they return, they end up beginning to reform the church even more. And it is in this kind of cultural milieu that we get the ideas of Richard Hooker. And if you remember, the ideas of Richard Hooker were the ones that sparked our first 3 videos. It was out of his writings that we get the idea of scripture, reason, and tradition. So the Reformations don't just change the political landscape by breaking people from Rome, by allowing people their own freedom to understand and to govern themselves, leading to both revolt and war, which create and change the face of Europe. But it also leads to a change of society and a societal understanding of theology. As you can well appreciate, this whistle-stop tour hardly scratches the surface of everything that is going on during the Reformation, but hopefully it's given you a way to orientate yourself when we begin to talk more about them. Running through all of this, you have heard me mention the translation of the Bible. We don't get to a full translation in English and for a few more years yet. But the translations that do exist, both in German and in English, aren't the only ones. We get translations in all native languages. These translations, condemned by the Roman Catholic Church, lead to this underground idea of copying out the Bible and passing it round one to another, and becomes very reminiscent of how the early Christians under oppression began keeping and protecting the Gospels themselves, writing down, copying the letters, passing them on one to another. This is the start of what is basically modern Christianity. We've got one more step to go through, which is the Enlightenment, which we'll be covering in our next video. We will probably return to some elements of this, especially the history of the King James Bible, in a later video. I hope that you've enjoyed this video and that you found it of use to you in orientating yourself. But like I said, it is quite a big section to cover in a short video. I hope that you will be joining us for our next video, and I hope that you found this one of use. If you've got any questions, and there may be plenty, please do get in touch. And you can get in touch on our Twitter and on our Facebook page or through our website. And don't be afraid to ask questions, because if you have questions, I'm sure that there will be other people out there who also have questions. So please do ask them. I hope you've had a great day, and I hope that this video finds you safe and well. Look after yourselves, stay home, stay safe, and go with God. Take care. Goodbye.